Thanks very much. I want to endorse the acknowledgements of country which have already been made, and to acknowledge that the University of Sydney is built on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that I live and have worked a lot, particularly since COVID, on Darug country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I just want to give a very brief introduction to my own work. I've been researching in climate law for 30 years, starting in 1997. And for the first, I would say, 15 years, my work focused on emissions reduction, the whole mitigation side, including REDD+. And then came 2009, the Copenhagen negotiations, which almost fell over. And I realized then that it was time to turn my attention to disaster law. So I've been engaged in thinking about climate justice and disaster law ever since 2009. And so my book, Climate Justice and Disaster Law, looks at the key sort of international features of disasters and law, but goes in 2 chapters to the ideas of compensation, and it is specifically focused on the human experience. But after the fires in 2019, 2020, I've been unable to look away from the impacts of those fires on what we, my co-authors and I now refer to as Earth Others. And so in the last 5 years, I've been researching on multi-species climate justice, and I'm working with Danny Sellermeyer, a philosopher and ethicist at Sydney Uni, and Philippa McCormack, who's an environmental lawyer. And we're writing multi-species climate justice, disaster and responsibility. And our own subtitle is Catching the Drift of the Revolutionary Spirit. And we're thinking about how to protect the freedoms and functionings of Earth Others. And we're looking to provide multi-species justice principles for rewriting international and domestic climate and environmental laws. So in doing this, we're acknowledging the fact that we are thinking, writing, and living in the polycrisis. So what is the polycrisis? We're experiencing the complexity of multiple entangled systemic breakdowns, and these are the climate, the ecological, but politically the political crisis in which we currently live. We have been living in political crises forever, but just talking today about how difficult it is to feel optimistic given what's happening in the United States. So this is the polycrisis, which has the potential to cause a cascading runaway failure of Earth's natural and social systems that irreversibly, and I want to focus on that word, and catastrophically degrades humanity's and Earth Others' prospects. What do reparations look like? And I know that yesterday you would have spoken about it so much and continuing today. Now, what the ICJ said in the certain activities case, according to international law, reparation must cease all consequences of the unlawful act and reestablish the situation which existed prior to the occurrence of the breach. And my question is whether or not that is actually possible. And I think we have to accept the impossibility of full reparations for climate-induced loss and damage. Just when we think about loss and damage, inherent in that concept is the notion that loss indicates irreversible damage and also reparable harm. So when we're talking about reparations, what do we mean? And also, as previous speakers have said, we're thinking about economic and non-economic losses, and generally environmental or multi-species losses would be falling into the category of non-economic loss. So, of course, our question is, who is deserving of reparations for loss and damage, because so much of the discussion and the international materials is about the human experience. And so we want to disrupt that notion of who is deserving of reparations, and to think about Earth others. So I'm going to just refer to Donna Haraway for a moment, because this really, I think, clarifies the idea of why we need to disrupt that notion of human-only reparations. It matters what matters we use to think about matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, what thoughts, think thoughts, what descriptions describe description, what ties, ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And that is really our entire project with this book, because we acknowledge the impossibility of the autonomous human agent. And relying on evolutionary biology, most of the 37 trillion cells in our bodies have a lifespan of days to weeks. New molecules continually flow through us, derived from atoms from the furthest reaches of the universe, which have made up the bodies. Sorry, I just need to go to my notes because there's something blocking the screen here. Which have made up the bodies of countless other plants and animals before us. Most of the cells in our body are not even human, as we contain more bacterial than human cells, and some of these influence our moods and manipulate our behavior, detracting from our supposed autonomy. And so we adopt a capabilities approach to multi-species justice. And essentially what that means is recognizing that all matter has vitality and agency, and that humans and Earth others are constitutive of each other. It recognizes the crucial ties between humans, Earth others, culture, and identity, and it rejects the logic of extensionalism, which is so often applied, such as animal sentience, as insidiously preserving the imaginary that equates subjects of justice with human individual capacities. It accepts the impossibility of the individual in economic life and the dissolution of the autonomous agent. And rather what we're looking for is a process of sympathetic imagining or biocentric wonder to see ourselves striving in the polycrisis alongside other living forms, and considering their flourishing and shared vulnerabilities. So given that that is the essential idea of multi-species recognition, what are we wanting to recognize? Well, influenced by the capabilities approach is to look at the capabilities of Earth others, and from litigation and legislation and so on, these seem to be the capabilities that we're talking about: existing, persisting, thriving, flourishing, functioning, regenerating, recovering, and evolving. And if we're talking about reparations, it goes to all of those issues. So recognition, why? Why are we engaging in this project at all? Because we need a new kind of theorizing brought about by the complete failure, as we've spoken about, of international and domestic institutions which are charged with taking responsibility for the polycrisis. Traditional remedies will not suffice, as the Colombian Constitutional Court told us in a trato. It requires complex measures and an interinstitutional articulation. As David Tackix has said, we need a radical, to the roots rejigging of our legal system towards sanity, and others have called for a complete reimagination of the law. So when we think about reparations, we are using the approach which I used in my book, which is to acknowledge that reparations are often seen as occurring as in the final phase, the fourth phase. But the first phase is prevention or mitigation, of course, and then the second phase, response, so rescues, and I'm thinking here as well about species during disaster. The third phase, recovery and rebuilding, which is often seen as the cleanup, remediation, or rehabilitation phase. And then finally, the compensation and risk transfer phase. But of course, disasters don't happen in this linear fashion, and that humans and Earth others are often experiencing all phases all at one time. So we've been on an interdisciplinary basis trying to think about some guiding principles. And I don't have time to go through those now, but anyway, to move on to thinking about where to derive the funding from, and we've spoken about different countries and so on, but in 2013, I wrote this article on a fossil fuel funded disaster response fund, and it was inspired by existing reparations schemes where levies and taxes are imposed on the polluters, including the fuel companies, under CERCLA, which is hazardous chemicals scheme in the US, the Global Oil Pollution Fund, the James Hardie Asbestos Fund, and the Japanese Nuclear Disaster Fund. And I did a very in-depth study of the way that all of those funds operate, including for the funds which provide for environmental damage. So what I've done subsequently is to think about how we value and compensate environmental damage. And of course, the first difficulty is thinking about the meaning of value itself. And typically, as we know, economists divide value into use values and non-use values. And the environment, even though we may value it in so many different ecological, aesthetic, cultural, and other ways, are defined as by economists as non-use values. So do we have any schemes currently in Australia that think about reparations? Well, I've given some examples that we have that exist. For example, the EPA requiring upfront security for cleanup costs where the environment has been damaged, pollution penalty orders, anticipatory damages in planning schemes where payments of money are required to mitigate any future harm from the developments and so on. But one of the most intriguing ones is the in-depth study that I've done into CERCLA, which is the Hazardous Chemicals Fund in the United States. And what that requires is the calculation for restoring, rehabilitating, and replacing economic costs of those use values. But it also tries to think about loss of use values. And when it does this, it talks only about humans, their loss of recreation, their loss of fishing, agriculture, and tourism. When they talk about cultural losses, they're really talking about the loss which humans suffer, and then aesthetic losses, how humans lose out on passive bird watching, scenic views, and vistas. So there really is an inadequate acknowledgement of, Earth others and damages to the environment. So how do the economists calculate these compensatory damages? And in the literature, there's about a dozen different kinds of methodologies which economists use to try to work out these losses, these environmental losses to humans. And essentially, they say to humans under this contingent value method, we're trying to work out how to calculate these damages. And they use a method which is to survey humans and ask them what they would be willing to pay. in terms of reparations for the environmental losses. And I mean, I don't have to really explain how totally inappropriate that is as an approach. The only one which I could find which vaguely looks at habitat is one which is called the equivalency offset approach, which essentially deals with offsetting one system that has been damaged for another. And I've written a lot about biodiversity trading, offsets, and as environmental lawyers, we know about some of those problems. So in the ICJ's case, the Costa Rica versus Nicaragua case, where Costa Rica was basically taking Nicaragua to the court for damages to its wetlands as a result of infrastructure projects undertaken by Nicaragua, the ICJ said, well, when we think about how to compensate Costa Rica, we're going to take an ecosystem services approach. And this is the approach adopted by economists to try to separate out various aspects on the environment. And they have separated them out into services, provisioning services, so food and so on, regulating services such as water purification from wetlands, habitat and supporting services, cultural services, and so on. But essentially at the heart of the ICJ's decision is thinking about the impacts for humans as well in terms of these environmental damages. But what the ICJ basically concludes is that it must take into account the processes of natural regeneration. So we have to think about the fact that natural systems can regenerate, and that means that we're going to reduce the monetary value owed to Costa Rica. Now, one of the commentators thinking about that CVM approach said, we don't need to survey people. What we should do is think about damages in the way that damages for pain and suffering is thought about. And essentially what the commentators are saying is that the pain and suffering of humans is an example where non-market losses can be priced by juries. And this is a very standard technique. And essentially what they're saying is that there is no standard for measuring these damages. Juries are appointed to award these damages, and they are expected, by using their background and experience and their enlightened conscience, to consider testimony given by assessing the victim's experience. And so my question is whether or not we can use this to think about Earth others and their experiences. And we straight away get up against this problem of who speaks on behalf of Earth others. So there is wonderful work, I can't go through it now, on how, for example, trees tell their own stories and how trees communicate through mycorrhizal functions with other parts of the natural system. So how can juries take account of the kinds of communications which Earth others have with each other and with us? But we need to ask, what is communication? Do speaking, signaling, stating, messaging, and expressing count? Because the evolutionary biologists are telling us that this is what the natural world is doing all the time. And so this morning, I was very interested and pleased to discover that researchers working in the United States have built a unique library of sounds produced by known individual common bottlenose dolphins, and they've been studying them for decades. And so for the first time in the history of the study of wild cetaceans, they've built a catalogue of sounds known to have been produced by specific individual animals. And essentially, they are developing an innovative research tool to show the language of these bottlenose dolphins. And this is just one example of the spectrogram of a signature whistle for each of the 269 dolphins which they have been studying in Saratoga. So they've just won, and I was so encouraged to see this, they've just won a $100,000 prize under the Collar Doolittle Prize for two-way interspecies communication. And as one of the judges, a professor at the LSE, said, is that the main thing stopping humans from cracking the code of animal communication is a lack of data. And he says, think of the trillion words needed to train a large language model like ChatGPT. We don't have anything like this for other animals. So this is so encouraging, right? The kind of work that is being done in these evolutionary biology, but also in real time in terms of trying to understand communication from Earth others. Now, in the meantime, as we know, particularly as lawyers, is that we have relied on human institutions of representation. And current examples in particularly legislation, but also in litigation, where the humans are being expected to speak up for Earth others, such as, of course, First Nations people, legal guardians, administrative agencies, multi-representative governing boards, trustees, scientists, and others. And what the ICJ has also said is that payment for restoration is not going to suffice. And I also can't think about the numbers that are required. And it seems as if the economists and others are doing a really bad job at the moment of thinking about the numbers of dollars that is required for damage to the environment. And what the ICJ said is that active restoration measures are needed. So the EU's nature restoration law, which you may not have heard about yet, that was passed last year and adopted in June, requires all member states to develop national restoration plans by July 2026 to implement effective area-based restoration measures to restore at least 20% of land and sea areas by 2030 and to restore all ecosystems in need by 2050. And the specific targets that are set are for indicators like pollinator populations, forest biodiversity and connectivity, urban green spaces and tree cover, and agricultural land with high diversity features. And so essentially, I think what the presentation has shown is that we still don't even yet have the right methodologies in place for thinking about how to value damage to the environment and to think about the number that is needed for reparations. I'm sure that there have been so many presentations about the lack of funds for reparations for humans, let alone for thinking about the reparations that are needed for Earth others.